the hell let those people into our gala?
Richard Whitmore's voice cut through Manhattan's most exclusive charity ballroom like a knife. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned toward the entrance, where Danielle and Jordan Carter stood with their invitation, facing 300 of America's wealthiest elite. "This is supposed to be invitation only," Margaret whispered, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Standards have really dropped." Danielle squeezed her husband's hand. She'd faced hostile situations before, but nothing felt quite like this moment, being judged and dismissed by people who didn't even know her name. What would you do if New York's most powerful family treated you like an unwelcome intruder? How far would you let them go before you fought back? Sometimes the people who look down on you have no idea who they're really dealing with. The hostess at the reception desk looked up from her seating chart with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to managing Manhattan's social hierarchy. Her eyes flickered over Danielle and Jordan with barely concealed surprise before settling into professional politeness tinged with something colder. "Good evening," Danielle said, extending their invitation. "The Carters." The woman's manicured finger traced down the list, pausing longer than necessary. "Oh, yes, here you are. Table 12. She gestured vaguely toward the back corner of the ballroom, away from the prime real estate near the stage where the auction would take place. Jordan frowned, reading over Danielle's shoulder. "The invitation says table 3. "Oh, my." The hostess's laugh carried just a hint of condescension. "There must be some mistake. Table 3 is reserved for our platinum sponsors. Table 12 will be much more comfortable for you." Danielle's training in boardroom negotiations kicked in, the same measured calm she used when billion-dollar deals hung in the balance. "I'm quite certain table 3 is correct." Her voice carried quiet authority, though she kept her tone pleasant. The hostess's smile tightened. After a moment of tense silence and a discreet check of her computer, she conceded with obvious reluctance. "Of course. Right this way." As they followed her through the crowd, Danielle noticed how conversations paused in their wake. A silver-haired man in an obvious Savile Row tuxedo leaned toward his companion. "Standards certainly have evolved." His wife, dripping in diamonds that caught the light like tiny stars, replied just loud enough to be heard. "The committee is becoming far too inclusive." Margaret Whitmore, resplendent in a vintage Chanel gown that had probably cost more than most cars, watched their approach with the intensity of a hawk studying potential prey. "Richard," she murmured to her husband, "this event used to have such distinction." Jordan's jaw tightened, his hand finding Danielle's lower back in a gesture both protective and steadying. But Danielle's expression remained serene, almost curious, as if she were observing a fascinating social experiment rather than living through one. She catalogued each slight, each pointed look, each whispered comment with the precision of someone building a case. At table 3, their assigned seats offered a perfect view of the Whitmore family table. Richard III held court like an aging king, his sons flanking him with the easy confidence of inherited privilege. The youngest, Robert, barely 30 and already soft around the edges from too much good living, kept glancing their way with unconcealed disdain. "Well," Danielle murmured, settling into her chair with graceful composure, "this should be educational." The first course arrived with a flourish of servers in crisp white uniforms, but the elegant presentation of seared foie gras couldn't distract from the increasingly pointed comments drifting from nearby tables. The Whitmores had apparently decided that subtle hostility was insufficient for the occasion. "I do wonder about the vetting process these days," Margaret announced to her table, her voice pitched to carry just far enough. "One simply never knows who might appear at these intimate gatherings." Robert Whitmore, emboldened by his second glass of wine, turned in his chair to address them directly. "Excuse me, but I don't believe we've been introduced." "I'm Robert Whitmore." His tone suggested this should mean something significant. Jordan straightened, recognizing the challenge in the younger man's voice. "Jordan Carter, and this is my wife, Danielle." Carter? Robert pretended to consider the name. Can't say I'm familiar with the family. What business are you in? Investment management, Danielle replied evenly, cutting a precise bite of her untouched appetizer. Oh, how interesting. Real estate? Small businesses? The condescension dripped from his words like honey from a spoon. We're always curious about emerging markets. The pause that followed was weighted with meaning. Around them, other conversations had quieted, creating an uncomfortable spotlight on their exchange. Danielle could feel the attention like physical pressure, but her training in high-stakes negotiations had taught her the power of strategic silence. We handle various portfolios, she said finally, her tone giving nothing away. Richard III leaned forward, clearly enjoying his son's performance. Portfolios, how modern. In our family, we prefer to build lasting institutions, legacy companies that span generations. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Though I suppose everyone has to start somewhere. Jordan's napkin crumpled in his fist, but Danielle's hand on his wrist was barely perceptible, yet unmistakably cautionary. She reached for her phone, a movement so subtle it might have been adjusting her bracelet, and typed a quick message beneath the table. To any observer, she appeared to be simply listening to the conversation with polite interest. But Margaret Whitmore was observant, and her eyes narrowed as she caught the gesture. How rude, she said loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, using one's phone during dinner conversation. I suppose manners vary by background. The word hung in the air like smoke, its implications clear to everyone present. The surrounding tables had gone completely quiet now, the elegant dinner transformed into a spectacle. Danielle's phone buzzed once in response to her message, and she allowed herself the smallest smile. You're absolutely right about manners, she said, meeting Margaret's gaze directly. They do reveal quite a lot about a person's true character. The auction portion of the evening began with the usual fanfare, but the real entertainment was clearly happening at table 3. Richard Whitmore III had warmed to his role as unofficial host of the evening's most compelling drama, and his voice carried the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Now this is fascinating, he said, ostensibly to his wife, but clearly intended for a wider audience. $500,000 for scholarship funding. He was referring to Danielle's bid, which had been accepted moments earlier amid shocked murmurs from the crowd. Quite ambitious for, he paused as if searching for the right phrase, newcomers to our little community. Margaret laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. Darling, you're being charitable. Some people simply don't understand that throwing money around doesn't actually buy class or acceptance. The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Around them, other guests shifted uncomfortably, some looking away entirely while others leaned in with the morbid fascination of drivers passing a car accident. The evening's elegant veneer was cracking, revealing something uglier underneath. I do hope their check clears, Robert added with a wine-loosened grin. It would be so embarrassing for the scholarship committee if... He let the sentence hang, the implication clear enough to draw gasps from nearby tables. Jordan's chair scraped against the marble floor as he began to rise, his face dark with anger. But Danielle's hand on his arm stopped him cold. Her expression remained perfectly composed, almost serene, as if she were watching a play rather than being subjected to deliberate humiliation. Interesting perspective, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Though I wonder if you're familiar with the legal implications of defamation at public events. Richard III's laughter boomed across the ballroom. Legal implications? My dear, this is simply honest concern for the integrity of our charitable institutions. When people like, he gestured vaguely in their direction, attempt to buy their way into society they don't understand, it reflects poorly on all of us. The phrase people like seemed to echo in the sudden quiet, its racist undertones unmistakable to everyone present. Phones had begun to appear throughout the ballroom, their cameras discreetly recording what was rapidly becoming a viral moment. The charity gala was transforming into something else entirely, a real-time documentation of privilege confronting its own ugly reflection. Danielle's phone buzzed continuously now, messages flooding in from various sources, but she ignored them all except for one. Her thumbs moved across the screen with deliberate precision. Martha, prepare for full review of Whitmore Industries' position. All options on the table. Authorization code, Justice 7. Margaret noticed the texting again, and her voice rose sharply. This is exactly what I mean about breeding. In civilized society, one doesn't conduct business during social events. She turned to the surrounding tables as if seeking validation. Standards have simply disappeared, but Danielle was no longer listening to Margaret Whitmore. She was watching her husband's face, seeing the hurt beneath his anger and feeling something crystallize inside her chest. Not rage was unfocused, counterproductive. This was something colder, more precise. This was power recognizing itself in the mirror and deciding it was time to stop hiding. "You know," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent section of the ballroom, "it's remarkable how revealing these kinds of events can be, how they show us exactly who people really are when they think there are no consequences for their choices." Richard III's smile faltered slightly, something in her tone registering as different from the submissive responses he'd expected. But before he could respond, the evening's main speaker was being introduced, and the spotlight literally shifted away from their table toward the stage. The temporary reprieve felt like the eye of a hurricane deceptively calm before the real storm arrived. The keynote speech about education and opportunity felt like bitter irony given what was unfolding in the VIP section, but Robert Whitmore seemed to view the momentary lull as merely an intermission in his evening's entertainment. When the applause died down and the guests began moving toward the reception area for networking, he pushed back from his table with the exaggerated confidence of someone who'd never met real opposition. "You know what?" he announced, his voice cutting through the polite cocktail chatter. "I think we need to address the elephant in the room." The metaphor hung in the air, loaded with implications that made several guests visibly wince. "This is supposed to be an exclusive event. Exclusive means something." The crowd around them began to thicken as other guests, drawn by the unmistakable scent of scandal, drifted closer under the pretense of admiring the auction displays. Jordan stood slowly, his full height imposing in the elegant space, but Danielle remained seated, her posture relaxed yet alert, like a chess master studying the board. "Exclusive," she repeated thoughtfully as if tasting the word. "Interesting choice. What exactly do you think that means?" "It means standards," Margaret interjected, stepping up beside her son with the bearing of someone marshalling reinforcements. "It means contributing members of society. It means people who belong." The word belong seemed to galvanize the growing crowd of onlookers. Phones were emerging more openly now, the pretense of discretion abandoned as the confrontation escalated beyond typical society gossip into something more significant. The live streams that had started as casual documentation of a charity gala were now broadcasting what looked increasingly like a public trial. "People who belong," Danielle repeated, and now there was something different in her voice. Not anger, but a kind of cold amusement. "According to whom?" Richard III moved to flank his wife and son, the family presenting a united front of generational wealth and inherited prejudice. "According to those of us who built this community, who created the institutions that make events like this possible." His gesture encompassed the glittering ballroom, the expensive art on the walls, the very foundation of old money Manhattan. "This isn't about exclusion, it's about preservation." The crowd had grown larger now, forming loose concentric circles around the central drama. Some faces showed embarrassment, others fascination, still others the uncomfortable recognition of witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond this single evening. The charity gala had become something else entirely, a public reckoning with issues that polite society usually kept carefully hidden. Preservation, Jordan said, speaking for the first time in several minutes. His voice carried years of experience with exactly this kind of coded language. That's a pretty word for what you're really talking about. Robert stepped closer, his wine-flushed face ugly with aggression. What we're talking about is maintaining standards that took generations to build, standards that can't be bought with a single donation, no matter how much you people think money solves everything. The phrase, "you people," detonated in the elegant space like a verbal bomb. The surrounding crowd reacted with audible intakes of breath, uncomfortable shifting, and a few guests actually stepping back as if to distance themselves from what was happening, but the phones kept recording and the livestream viewers kept climbing. Danielle's own phone was buzzing almost constantly now, but she finally began to pay attention to it. Her screen showed messages from her chief of staff, her legal team, her board of directors, all marked urgent. But more interesting were the notifications from social media platforms. Their hashtag Gala Justice was already trending, with viewer counts climbing into the millions. "You know what's fascinating about standards," she said, looking up from her phone with an expression that made several people in the crowd step back involuntarily, "is that they're only as solid as the people who enforce them. And sometimes those people turn out to be building on much shakier ground than they realized." She stood then, her movement fluid and controlled, and suddenly the dynamics of the entire scene shifted. There was something in her bearing now that hadn't been there before, or perhaps it had always been there, carefully hidden beneath layers of politeness and social convention. The woman who rose from table 3 was not the same one who had walked quietly into the ballroom earlier that evening. Margaret Whitmore must have sensed the change, because her voice rose sharply, almost desperately. "Security! Security! This has gone far enough. These people are disrupting a private charitable event." But the security guards who began moving toward their area looked uncertain, checking their earpieces and speaking in low, urgent tones. Something was happening beyond their immediate view, communications flowing from sources they couldn't see. The evening was spiraling beyond anyone's control, and the carefully orchestrated hierarchy of the charity gala was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Danielle smiled then for the first time all evening, and it was not a pleasant expression. The security guards approached with the hesitant steps of men suddenly uncertain about their authority. Their earpieces crackled with chatter, and their eyes kept shifting between the Whitmore family and their phones, which were apparently delivering information that complicated their understanding of the situation. "Ma'am, sir," the lead guard addressed Danielle and Jordan with careful politeness, "we need to ask you to—" His words were cut off by the unmistakable ring of a phone on speaker mode. Danielle had answered without looking at the caller ID, and a crisp, professional voice filled the sudden silence around table 3. "Miss Carter, this is Martha Fleming, your chief of staff. I apologize for interrupting your evening, but the Whitmore Industries emergency board meeting has been moved up to tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Their CFO has called 3 times in the last hour requesting confirmation of the bailout package approval." The effect was immediate and devastating. Richard Whitmore III went completely still, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. Margaret's face drained of color, and Robert looked genuinely confused, glancing between his parents as if waiting for someone to explain the punchline of a joke he didn't understand. "Carter," Richard whispered, and the word seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet space around them. "Carter Global." Danielle's finger hovered over the phone screen for a moment that stretched like eternity. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the ballroom, projected by the phone's speaker to an audience that now hung on every word. "Martha, I've had some time to think about the Whitmore Industries situation tonight. Cancel tomorrow's meeting." "Ma'am?" Martha's voice carried a note of surprise. "The $30 billion package? Should I reschedule?" "No." The word was quiet, but absolute. "Terminate negotiations immediately. Effective as of this moment, Carter Global is withdrawing from all discussions with Whitmore Industries. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of a world shifting on its axis, of assumptions crumbling in real time, of power revealing itself in ways that no one in that glittering ballroom had anticipated. Phones throughout the crowd were capturing every moment, broadcasting the scene to millions of viewers who were witnessing something unprecedented. The immediate public consequence of institutional racism meeting unrecognized power. Margaret Whitmore was the first to break. "That's impossible," she said, her voice high and strained. "You can't be. You're nobody. You're nothing." But even as she spoke, her husband was placing urgent calls, his fingers shaking as he dialed. The conversations were brief and devastating. Within minutes, the truth was confirmed through multiple sources. The woman they had spent the evening humiliating was indeed the CEO of Carter Global, the private investment firm that controlled assets worth more than the GDP of small countries. Jordan stepped closer to his wife, and for the first time all evening, his expression held something other than restraint or anger. It held pride. "Gentlemen," he said to the security guards, who were now standing at respectful attention, "I believe you were about to escort someone from the premises." Robert Whitmore had gone from confusion to panic in the space of a few phone calls. Wait, this is all a misunderstanding. We didn't know." "No," Danielle said, her voice cutting through his protests with surgical precision. "You didn't know. But here's the interesting thing about not knowing. It doesn't excuse knowing better and choosing worse." She gestured to the crowd that had gathered, to the phones recording every word, to the servers and staff who had witnessed the entire exchange. "Everyone here tonight saw exactly who you choose to be when you think there are no consequences. The only difference now is that there are." The head of security approached with an expression of professional mortification. "Miss Carter, on behalf of the venue, I want to offer our sincerest apologies for—" She held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to everyone else who's ever walked through these doors and been made to feel like they didn't belong because of the color of their skin, or the size of their bank account, or the family they were born into." Her phone rang again, and this time she glanced at the screen before answering. "Yes, this is Danielle Carter." "No, the decision is final, because character matters more than money, and tonight I learned exactly what theirs is worth." The Whitmore family stood frozen in a tableau of shock and dawning horror, watching their world crumble in real time, broadcast live to an audience that was growing by the minute. The charity gala had become something none of them had expected, a public reckoning with power, privilege, and the true cost of both. The next 72 hours unfolded with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche. By morning, #Whitmore Racism was trending globally with over 50 million engagements. The video footage from the gala, captured from dozens of angles and pieced together by internet sleuths, told a story so clear and damning that no amount of public relations damage control could contain it. Carter Global's official statement was released at market opening. After careful consideration of recent events that revealed fundamental incompatibilities in corporate values, Carter Global has terminated all business relationships with Whitmore Industries, effective immediately. The financial markets responded with brutal efficiency. Whitmore Industries stock, already vulnerable due to their debt crisis, collapsed by 67% in the first hour of trading. The company that had survived the Great Depression, multiple recessions, and countless economic upheavals found itself facing bankruptcy because of one family's inability to control their prejudices at a charity dinner, Richard Whitmore. The third's attempts to reach Danielle Carter were met with professional silence. His calls went to voicemails that were never returned. His lawyers were told that Carter Global's legal department would communicate only through official channels. His desperate emails generated auto-responses directing him to the company's public relations department. Margaret Whitmore, facing social exile from the circles that had defined her entire existence, agreed to a humiliating interview with a morning news program. "We made terrible mistakes," she said, her voice shaking as she read from prepared notes. "We let prejudice cloud our judgment, and we are deeply sorry." But the words rang hollow against the backdrop of decades of behavior that the viral video had brought into sharp focus. Robert Whitmore faced the swiftest consequences. The board of directors of Whitmore Industries, terrified by the public relations catastrophe and desperate to distance themselves from the family's actions, voted unanimously to remove him from all positions within the company. His trust fund, tied to company performance, evaporated along with the stock price. The human cost mounted quickly. 3,000 employees received layoff notices as Whitmore Industries struggled to maintain operations without the Carter Global bailout. Pension funds tied to company stock lost billions. Suppliers and contractors faced uncertainty as the company's creditworthiness crumbled. But the social consequences cut even deeper. The Union Club revoked the Whitmores' membership in an emergency session. The Yacht Club, the Country Club, the private school boards, one by one. The institutions that had formed the bedrock of their identity turned away from the family that had become synonymous with public racism. Legal consequences followed swiftly. Carter Global's legal team filed a comprehensive lawsuit alleging discrimination, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The case was strengthened by the extensive video evidence and the testimony of dozens of witnesses who had watched the events unfold. Within a week, the Whitmore family's Manhattan penthouse was quietly listed for sale. The Hamptons estate followed. Art collections that had been in the family for generations went to auction houses, their provenance now a liability rather than an asset. The yacht, the private jet, the collection of vintage cars, all of it liquidated in a desperate attempt to satisfy creditors and legal settlements. Social media justice proved as swift as it was merciless. Every Whitmore family member found their social media accounts flooded with documentation of their past behavior. Investigative journalists discovered a pattern of discrimination in hiring practices, charitable giving that excluded minority organizations, and a family foundation that had never awarded grants to institutions serving communities of color. The charity that had hosted the gala issued a statement permanently banning the Whitmore family from future events and announcing new diversity and inclusion requirements for all major donors. Other charitable organizations quickly followed suit, creating a comprehensive social exile that extended far beyond New York's society circles. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was the silence. The Whitmores, who had spent generations as fixtures of society pages and charitable committees, suddenly found themselves invisible. Former friends no longer returned calls. Invitations stopped arriving. The power that had seemed so absolute, so permanent, proved to be built on foundations as fragile as public opinion. 1 week after the gala, Danielle Carter stood at the podium in the Carter Global Headquarters conference room, facing a packed audience of journalists, community leaders, and employees. The wall of windows behind her framed the Manhattan skyline, but the view seemed different now, less intimidating, more accessible. "I've been asked many times this week whether I regret how these events unfolded," she began, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had defined her response throughout the crisis. "The answer is simple. I regret that it was necessary." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. What happened at that gala wasn't about one family's prejudices. It was about a system that has allowed those prejudices to flourish unchallenged for generations. It was about the countless people who have walked into rooms where they weren't welcome and been made to feel less than human because of the color of their skin. Jordan sat in the front row, his expression proud but serious. Beside him, employees who had worked for Carter Global for years were seeing their CEO in a new light, not just as a brilliant businesswoman, but as someone willing to sacrifice profits for principles. "Some have called our response harsh," Danielle continued. $30 billion is significant money, and the consequences for the Whitmore family and their employees have been severe. But here's what I want everyone to understand. This was never about revenge. This was about accountability. She gestured to a projection screen that displayed the Carter Global Empowerment Initiative, a $30 billion program that had been announced earlier that week. We didn't cancel the Whitmore deal to destroy them. We canceled it to build something better. That money is now going to minority-owned businesses, historically black colleges and universities, and community development programs in underserved areas. The murmurs of approval from the audience were audible, but Danielle raised a hand for silence. I want to be clear about something else. The Whitmore family's behavior was unacceptable, but it wasn't unique. They simply had the misfortune to display their prejudices in front of cameras at a moment when their targets had the power to respond. Her expression softened slightly, revealing the woman behind the CEO persona. Every day, people face discrimination in hiring, in housing, in healthcare, in education. They face it in stores and restaurants and schools and workplaces. Most of them don't have the resources to fight back the way we did. That's what we need to change. She moved away from the podium, her gesture including the entire room. The Whitmore family made choices that night. They chose to see skin color before humanity. They chose to assume inferiority based on race. They chose to use their perceived power to humiliate people they saw as beneath them. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. But we also made choices. We chose dignity over retaliation. We chose justice over revenge. We chose to build up rather than simply tear down. And that's the difference between power and strength. Power seeks to dominate, but strength seeks to elevate. Jordan stood then, moving to join his wife at the front of the room. When he spoke, his voice carried years of experience with exactly the kind of discrimination they had faced. My wife and I have been fortunate. We've built something that gave us options when we faced hatred. But for every video of discrimination that goes viral, there are thousands of incidents that never get recorded, never get seen, never get justice. He looked out at the audience, making eye contact with journalists whose coverage would carry this message far beyond the conference room. That's why this conversation can't end with one family's downfall. It has to continue in boardrooms and classrooms, in hiring decisions and housing policies, in every interaction where people make choices about how to treat someone who looks different from them. Danielle nodded, taking back the microphone. The Carter Global Empowerment Initiative isn't charity, it's investment. We're investing in the potential that gets overlooked, the talent that gets dismissed, the innovation that gets ignored because it comes from the wrong zip code or the wrong family background. She smiled then, the first genuinely warm expression she had shown since the gala. We're not trying to create a world without differences. We're trying to create a world where differences are celebrated rather than punished, where opportunity is based on merit rather than melanin, where respect is the default rather than something that has to be earned through wealth or status. As the press conference concluded and journalists rushed to file their stories, Danielle and Jordan remained on the stage, looking out at the city that had tried to reject them and ultimately been forced to recognize them. The view from the Carter Global headquarters encompassed all of Manhattan, including the building where the charity gala had taken place. A reminder that real power wasn't about who got invited to the party, but about who decided whether the party would continue. The story of the Whitmore family's fall and the Carter couple's rise resonated far beyond New York's social circles. Within days, it had become a case study in business schools, a talking point in corporate diversity training, and a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Social media campaigns emerged organically, with hashtag #ChooseDignity becoming a viral hashtag used to highlight both discrimination and positive responses to it. Companies rushed to review their own practices, terrified of becoming the next Whitmore Industries. University admissions offices reported surges in applications from underrepresented communities, citing the Carter story as inspiration. But perhaps the most powerful response came from individuals who began sharing their own stories of facing discrimination and choosing to respond with grace rather than anger. The Danielle Challenge encouraged people to document moments when they chose dignity over revenge, justice over retaliation, building up over tearing down. The ripple effects continued for months. The Whitmore Charity Gala, once an annual highlight of Manhattan's social calendar, was permanently discontinued. In its place, Carter Global launched the Empowerment Gala, an annual event celebrating minority entrepreneurs and changemakers. The first event, held 6 months later in the same ballroom, raised over $100 million for scholarship programs. Robert Whitmore, stripped of his trust fund and family connections, found himself working entry-level jobs and slowly learning lessons about humility that his privileged upbringing had never taught him. Some reports suggested he was attending community college, studying social work. Whether redemption was possible remained an open question. Margaret and Richard Whitmore III largely disappeared from public view, their social exile complete. Their former friends learned to navigate Manhattan society without the casual racism that had once been not just tolerated, but expected. The absence of their voices created space for new ones' voices that had always been there but had never been heard. But the true measure of change wasn't in the dramatic falls or rises of individual families. It was in the countless small moments when someone chose to see humanity first, when a hiring manager looked past assumptions, when a teacher encouraged a student others had written off, when a neighbor reached across difference to build community. The Carter Global headquarters became something of a pilgrimage site for young entrepreneurs of color, many of whom would leave meetings with funding, mentorship, or simply the knowledge that success was possible. Danielle and Jordan made themselves accessible in ways that old money Manhattan never had, understanding that representation without access was merely performance. Years later, when business historians wrote about the transformation of corporate America's approach to diversity and inclusion, they would point to a single evening in Manhattan as the moment when the conversation shifted from talking about change to demanding it. They would note that real power had always belonged to those who controlled capital, but that capital without character ultimately proved worthless. The ballroom where it all began still hosts charity events, but the guest lists look different now. The conversations sound different. The assumptions that once went unchallenged are now questioned openly. And somewhere in those changes, in those small daily choices to be better, the true legacy of that evening continues to unfold. Your voice matters. Your choices matter. When you witness injustice, will you stay silent or stand up? When you have power, will you use it to exclude or include? The world is watching, and the change starts with each decision you make about how to treat another human being. Share this story. Support businesses that value humanity over hierarchy. Vote for leaders who understand that diversity is strength. Speak up when you witness discrimination. Choose to build bridges instead of walls. Because in the end, character isn't measured by your bank account, your zip code, or the family you were born into. It's measured by how you treat people when you think no one is watching, and by what you do when you discover that everyone is.